morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to Inside the Writer's Studio, the podcast where we talk with writers about their lives, their craft, their business, and their latest work. I'm your host, Charlie Lovett, and our podcast is sponsored by Bookmarks. Bookmarks is a literary nonprofit whose programs include the largest annual book festival in the Carolinas. Come visit Bookmarks at our community gathering space and nonprofit independent bookstore in downtown Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Inside the Writer's Studio is also proud to be an affiliate of Libro FM, the audiobook platform that supports your local independent bookstore. Stay tuned at the end of the podcast for more information on Libro FM and a special offer. My guest today is Dwyer Murphy, whose novel The Stolen Coast has just been published. Dwyer, welcome to Inside the Writer's Studio.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a treat.
So we begin this novel's written in the first person, and we begin with a narrator who at first is unidentified to us. And he's talking about this other character named Tommy. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on beginnings, on what you hold back at the beginning, and then specifically on why you think Tommy was kind of the person to start with, as far as we know more about him in the opening passage than we know about the main character.
Yeah, I love writing in the first person generally, and then I find it doesn't always have, like any story, it doesn't have the most obvious starting point. But for me, I always need a conversation to get things going. I can't really begin with just a first person narrator who's going to tell you their own history or any too much scene setting. Even I feel like for me, for a story to get popping and really get started, I need to hear them talk and interact with another character. And, that's not always the most common thing in the first person, right? But to me, it brings out the character in a real way to hear those kind of human voices interacting and to hear how, in this case, he might describe another character. So the Tommy character is sort of a local hustler in this beach town in Massachusetts. And I thought it would be interesting to hear how our narrator might describe him and tell a little bit about his life, rather than trying to just, tell you all the essential facts about me, the narrator, right away. I wanted to throw him into a conversation, and that kind of brings the story alive in a different way for me.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, the book is set in coastal Massachusetts. It's set in a community called Onset that's right next to Cape Cod. Tell us a little bit about the setting, why you chose that setting, and about this. Because it's this rundown community that's like almost within sight of these palaces of great wealth, if you will.
Yeah, so essentially it's a romanticized, stylized, dramatized version of the town where I grew up, which is a small kind of coastal village in Massachusetts, directly next to Cape Cod, which I think people know of and have kind of an idea of what that wealth and the different culture that is Cape Cod. You have to cross over the canal to get there, and then once you're there, it feels like a different world. But I wanted to have some of that clash of culture, but also just this sense that you are in a place. This version of Onset. Onset is the real name of a village within the town where I grew up. Mm-hmm. I wanted to have this sense that you had kind of stepped away from reality and you were in this hidden pocket that is very much not what people think about it when they think of Massachusetts and crime fiction or the New England seaside retreats. This is its own little pocket that's kind of hidden away from the world. And that was important because this is a story essentially about people who have gone to the coast to disappear. They want to go to this town to start over. They're running from something and they want a new identity and a new life, and they gravitate towards this little town on the beach.
Yeah, I love the kind of nowhere feel of this town, and yet then you have these scenes where there's this big festival going on, and suddenly it's almost like two different towns. The town before the festival, and then the town during the festival.
Yeah, that's kind of how it is in a lot of summer towns, right? Like it comes alive in a different way when the season is on. And then even within that season, there are these different periods. You get tourists coming in, and you have the weekenders and people who've been renting the same places or have beach houses that were passed down from the family. But then the summer often gathers a momentum, especially in New England. There are a lot of festivals and these different cultural, ethnic festivals. In this coast, there's a large Portuguese and Cape Verdean diaspora, and so there are a lot of heritage festivals that descend through those communities. music festivals and seafood festivals. So I kind of threw together a few different Catholic feasts and fishermen's
Yeah.
feasts in together with a music festival. And I decided rather than having lots of them, I wanted one giant festival so that it gave the novel an extra kind of momentum
Yeah.
to be building towards that.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned about onset being, sort of just on one side of the Cape Cod Canal, and the Cape where we start thinking of, Kennedy's and everything else is on the other side. Class is clearly a factor in this novel. There are not very many places where old money is older than it is on Cape Cod, at least in the United States. Talk about a little bit about how class and class divides figure into the novel.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable when you have that kind of proximity, right? The especially in this case because there is a physical canal that is that's separating this town from Cape Cod, where this sort of in this version of the old wealth kind of begins. And I think that this is a crime story essentially. It's a heist story. There's a lot of there's a romance to it and a lot of other intrigue swirling around, but there's a heist structure to it, and I found it very satisfying when thinking about who needed to be robbed in this situation. I liked the idea of targeting some of this old money because there's a certain confidence that goes along with that particular brand of New England blue-blooded old money, where I think that you know down from the Puritan times, they feel like the people who have that kind of generational wealth feel like they did something right to earn it, and that it's theirs to protect, and they have no sins of their own, no skeletons in the closet. So the idea of a small heist crew targeting somebody like that and kind of exercising some of those class demands that I think are very just here was satisfying as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you talked about this as a heist, this is a crime novel. There's a lot of elements of what, for want of a better term, we could call the criminal underworld in this novel. I'm not going to ask you if you are familiar with that from personal experience, but I am curious about, how do you research and or imagine something which by its very nature is hidden and undocumented?
Yeah, I guess it goes back to I have a few connections to this where I was a lawyer before I was a writer and have always been interested in the idea of identity changes and kind of fleeing the jurisdiction. It was always just one of my pet subjects when I was a lawyer, that whenever I had a chance to research, I like to play this game. My wife is still a lawyer, and my father worked in intelligence, and I like to play this game with them where we reason through, if you were falsely committed of a serious crime and you needed to get out of the jurisdiction immediately, kind of go into the fugitive mode. How do you do it? How do you play that out? And it's sort of it's a game of ideas, and we kind of work our way through each step of the way. So that is kind of the premise of this book, is that the town, this little town in Massachusetts, is the way station where all sorts of fugitives and people who want to just get away and start a new life, they can all go to this town, and there's a service being provided by the characters where they'll get a new identity and access to different exits across the border and out of the country if they want it, or they can settle down to a new life. So it's a pet subject of mine, and it was a nice chance to kind of write this world full of sort of an Elmore Leonard feeling of lots of eccentric, talkative, chatty crooks and hustlers and operators wandering around the same place, all kind of working through their own dreams. And it's always been something I'm fascinated by.
I love your use of the word game. I think, I think of that a lot when writing a novel, when writing a thriller, especially, or a crime novel, that, we get to play this game in a legal way, because
Right.
it is a fascinating thing to figure out how would you rob this person, how would you commit this crime. Can you address that a little bit about the sort of the
Yeah, I think
mental
that's
activity of that game?
I think that's why people like heist stories in particular, right?
Yeah.
And within that, because there's a game element to it. It's almost always a slightly absurd setup to the heist itself, and the intricacy of a heist always seems a little ridiculous too. But I think we all like the idea that we could sit around and really put our minds to it and assemble just the right crew, and that we could take down a bank, or we could get into a safe. There's a real gamesmanship to it, right? And there's something more satisfying or more exciting, I guess, and purely exciting than imagining a different kind of thriller or crime novel where, like, what if somebody's trying to murder me or I'm trying to find a murderer? There isn't quite that same doom and gloom around it. It feels more like a game that you could just sit around and open a bottle of wine with your friends and think, okay, which of us is the safe cracker? Who's the getaway driver? Who's going to hand the note to the teller? And how are we going to pull this off?
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about Jack a little bit. You've sort of he is our main character. We eventually do learn his name and the narrator, and you've sort of alluded to how his business, but talk about how he came to this business through his father, and sort of a little more specifically what it is that he's doing here in Onset.
Yeah, Jack is kind of he's this Harvard educated lawyer who's living in his hometown and working with his father, who was an ex-spy who has a long time business where he kind of will gather people up and get them out of the country. Any sort of fugitive or crook or hustler is welcome in this town to get their new identity and move along. And so Jack is a lawyer who's kind of disillusioned, disaffected. Those are the kinds of lawyers I like best. And he's working in this business with his father where they take on all these people and they'll give them any new identity they need and move them out, which is, it's I am myself a disillusioned lawyer, and I've always liked that idea that I think most of us share some kind of fantasy or thought exercise where we'd like to believe that there's a place we could go and start over if we needed to. Sometimes you feel it on vacation, right? You walk by just the right beach bar and think, well, maybe I could start over there, and that'll be my bar, and I'll have a new name for it, and I'll start a life over. So they provide this kind of service to the people who can find them. And it was, nice to kind of write a father-son relationship as well. There's sort of a romance at the center of the story, but to the side, there's also this very important relationship between a father and a son that it was a pleasure to write, and it let me kind of think through some of my own past. So I think when people find out that your father had worked in intelligence, they want to know what was it like to have a father growing up. It mostly just meant that he caught me everything I tried to sneak past. He caught me. He knew it, but it was an interesting way to grow up, and kind of a nice little side piece to this story about a heist was to have that father in there too.
Yeah, and I love this idea that they often are stashing these people in vacation homes that are not currently being used. I find that the whole idea of just imagining these people coming back to their vacation homes and not realizing who's been there.
Yeah, if you've ever been in like a beach town in the off season, it's full of just these cottages that are more or less empty, and hotels and motels that are kind of flitting around. So it takes on a new energy in the summer, but there are always these empty places. And to me, it when you're young and you're growing up in a town like that, you can't help but break into a few and show yourself around. So if you've got an empty summer house in the off season, just know that occasionally teenagers are going to sneak into your house and find out what's going on there.
Yep. So at one point, Jack says, every people smuggler is a philosopher in his own squalid way. What do you think what is Jack's philosophy?
I think that, so it's funny. I was trying to imagine, I had another novel with another lawyer who was thinking about ways that they are distinct of one another. And I think Jack is working in the criminal world, but is essentially himself kind of a very sensitive, poetic soul who's walking around seeing the romantic seediness of his own life and wants something more, but isn't sure what it is. But a lot of this, I was trying to create this world that I've always been drawn to the idea of towns like a Casablanca or something on the edge of a continent, both the physical continent and the kind of imaginative continent where everybody's kind of got their dreams and they're thinking about their own dooms or their own possibilities, and that there's one kind of man at the center of this who is helping usher them along to that new life. So I think that he's somebody who can find romance and poetry in these squalid little moments. And he is himself, he's a sort of, like, he calls himself, or he is called derogatorily, the ferryman, because he's just moving people along to their next place. But I think that like like a Rick in Casablanca. He's got his own code and his own form of quiet, self-negating romance to it.
Yeah, I mean, I find it interesting that he's an ex-lawyer. He is mostly working with criminals, but he has a moral code. I mean, he's not just like, oh, I'll break any law, I'll do whatever. And for the most part, what he's doing is mostly legal, right?
Right. I mean, yeah, you if you ever need to start to create a new identity, there are ways to do it. Some of it might involve forging documents, but
Yeah.
not necessarily, right? Part of what he's doing is also, just people have very valid reasons sometimes for wanting to start over somewhere new and to create a new identity for themselves. They're not always just running from the law or crooks or debts. Sometimes people have very valid reasons for it. So there is a form of this that can be done legally, and I think Jack just he thrives in the gray areas of
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
particular morality.
Yeah. Jack's father describes the business as uh, an open, poorly understood secret in terms of the way other people in the community understand it. Talk about the relationship between Jack and his dad and their business and the community in which they live.
Yeah, this was a fancy of mine because I don't know how that business would actually operate. If you there's no town that I know of that one can go to now that is just the Casablanca where you get your exit visa. So I was thinking through how this might work because realistically, everybody's going to notice if hundreds of fugitives are moving through a small beach town that's essentially just a mile wide walking around. They're going to notice. So I wanted there to be this idea that everybody kind of understands what's going on, and in part they respect that it's another valid business that's operating. I think especially in New England, but probably a lot of small town places, people know how to mind their own business, and if they feel like you're not hiding it from them, you're not trying to keep it a secret and keep them out of it, they can invest a little piece of themselves in it too and find even maybe some pride in that local business that's thriving and doing very well, right? You see that with like marijuana dispensaries that are now popping up all over the place, that now they're legitimate, and a lot of communities rightly take pride in a really well-run business, no matter what the form or morality or ambiguities of it might be.
Yep. There's a particular thought that I think Jack says this, and I just love this because I think it gets at this weird dichotomy of a vacation community. It says a great deal of the local economy was formed around time, how to use it up, how to save it, how to conceive of its passage. Can you expand on that a little bit, and also about the way that the idea of time in a community like this plays out differently for different classes?
Yeah, well, so much of a summer community, a town that maybe doubles or triples its population in the summer, so much of the rest of the year is built with that period in mind. It's you're going to have to make hay while the sun is shining because that's the time that to make money and maybe to seize a few opportunities during that period when there are people there to spend money. And so I think that naturally what happens is it distorts and bends our sense of time or sense of the year. It's sort of built around this big period where there are going to be new faces, new people in town. But for them, this is a very different experience of the town. The people who are just coming in for a week or two in the summer, or maybe for a month, and that they come here every year and think of it as their own idol, this place that they've gone since their childhood. It's a completely different experience of that community and what those weeks of the summer mean compared to somebody who is, a lifer, a perennial resident, somebody who has got to be there in the depths of winter and the spring, and the passage of time is very different for those people. I think you think of the seasons differently too. You think of the period when the nor'easters are going to come in and what kind of damage that's going to do to the structures, how that's going to move the sandbars around and change the boating channels potentially, or how the salt air is going to work on a cottage. These communities, houses need to be painted and freshened up every season because salt, especially in the winter and the spring, those cold, salty winds, they come in and they wear down a community in a very different way. And I think the people who come in the summer and just see the new white paint and that the shingles are all fixed and everything is just so, they have a completely different experience of these towns from the people who are there getting that illusion ready. And the people who are doing that, I think, are owed a nice chunk of change. So they're working hard over the summer and trying to kind of put together as many jobs and sometimes hustles as they can. That money's going to have to last a lot of them through the winter as well.
There are quite obviously scenes and moments and bits of dialogue and in music and activities in this novel that are very directly related to the main plot. But then there are others that are not, that are there to sort of paint a picture of the world in which Jack exists. Talk to us a little bit about that, about crafting these scenes that paint a picture of this deeper world, without sort of slowing down the action of the novel at the same time.
Yeah, well, for me, I think the kind of novels and especially the kind of noir that I like is, I think, in a lot of ways the story is almost indistinguishable from the atmosphere. And I think that there are all these different elements to a story: the character, the plot, the voice, the atmosphere. And I try not to neglect that atmosphere. Maybe I do too much of it, but I just love that stuff. And so a lot of that on a craft level is about making sure that every interaction isn't just about moving to the next point in the plot, and that there's room enough both for the characters in the foreground to experience other pieces of life, but also the characters in the background. There's life swirling on around them and small dramas happening all around. And my own kind of pet love is just I love music and physical art and dancing and basketball and all of these things that have a certain choreography to them. So I like to load up a story with a lot of people dancing and playing basketball and eating food and drinking wine and saying prayers and listening to stories in the background. So whenever the characters, whenever I can make sure that they have a lot of that life in back of them and around them, I want to fill up the scene as much as possible.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking again about Casablanca, and you're talking about your love of music. And I think you ask almost anybody, "Oh, what's the best scene in Casablanca?" They're like, "Oh, where they sing La Marseillaise," which has nothing to do with the main plot of the movie, but it's exactly as you said. Just gives this great, incredible atmosphere. It tells you more about the emotions in that town than any other scene in the film. I think.
Isn't that a funny scene where I don't know how many times I've seen Casablanca and how many times I will see it. I always expect to eventually just go cold at that scene, that scene shouldn't be able to pull out my emotions the way it does.
Yeah.
But I can see it almost completely out of context and just catch that moment where they all stir up and come together. And every single time I'm moved, and it's an incredible swell of emotion, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. So on the flip side of what we were just talking about, in terms of there are scenes that are directly moving the plot forward. There's also some important actions and conversations that take place where our first person narrator can't necessarily see or hear them. How do you decide what not to show in terms of things that are moving that plot forward?
Yeah, well, I think especially in this kind of a story, which is it's a heist and a caper, and so necessarily there are double and triple crosses coming. And I tried to be realistic about what the narrator would know, and also use a narrator who is comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity and kind of trusts himself enough to believe that when the time comes, he'll act accordingly and know what to do and be able to handle himself well without needing to know every single piece of the story that is happening around him. And that was sort of at a character level, I wanted somebody who could accept a certain amount of uncertainty and move along with it and still kind of describe what he can describe and what there is without needing to feel like I'm going to explain every piece of it to you. And I think in a good heist story, we need enough of that, those twists and turns that are more about revealing a new layer to the doubt and to the conflicting players here, because you've got characters who actively know that they cannot trust one another, who are going to, for the interim, decide for one reason or another, for love or money, they're going to pretend to trust one another for a little while. And so that's kind of a fun dynamic to play with a first person narrator, where he might know that he cannot trust this other person, that there's a 70% chance that he's being double crossed here, but he's going to move ahead anyway because there's a certain openness to life that he's chosen in this story.
Yeah. So you mentioned briefly Elena already. Sort of the precipitating event of the novel here is the arrival of Jack's ex-girlfriend, Elena. She's a lawyer. She comes back from New York. Tell us a little bit about her and about how she seems to kind of straddle these two worlds of law and crime, or maybe you're going to tell me those are the same world.
Yeah, I think that's one of the ideas that's kind of percolating in her, at least while she's trying to convince Jack to rob somebody with her. She is a lawyer who is from this same little town, but kind of pieced together 7 or 8 jobs, and eventually got herself a new life as a lawyer in New York. But it's deeply unsatisfying to her. She's now kind of doing legal corruption, like she's corrupt still, and she's crooked, but it's all too legal and too above board for her. She's kind of she's a confidence artist. She's a hustler, and she's got the spirit that she sees a mark and she kind of needs to go after it. And so after a long hiatus, she's decided to come back to this town, and together with Jack, she's got that one big job that she wants to pull off. She's seen an opportunity to make a fortune, and she's going to go for it. But a lot of it is I wanted a heist story. I love a particular kind of, usually like a neo-noir, where there are two characters who are romantically entangled, but also criminally entangled. And every step of their plot, their heist is going to be another step of the courtship. And there's this dance where they decide whether or not they can trust one another, and the attraction is there regardless, but they know that they can't trust one another. And for her, she's essentially, I think most of the female leads that I write tend to be variations and versions on my wife, who's got a nice sense of international intrigue herself. So it was a lot of fun to kind of write some of the scenes between those characters getting tangled up, and to try to find some of the electricity between them.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about trust, because in a way that's true in any relationship, right? Even if you're not trying to pull off a big heist, but when you're in a novel like this, where there are these bigger stakes, than just are they or aren't they going to end up together, it sort of heightens all of that question of, do I trust this person? It seems to me it heightens everything about an interpersonal relationship.
Yeah, it's not just your heart on the line, it's also your physical person, your
Yeah.
freedom, liberty is on the line as well. So I think that was a big part of the fun, and it made it so that whenever they're together, it wasn't just another stage in their relationship, where it actually gives you quite a bit of freedom, I think, as a writer, to have that structure, that heist structure to it, because you can kind of rely that each of these scenes will have a built-in tension to them, and a kind of momentum to them, because they're all building towards this crime, and there's a danger to it. Will they get caught? Will they double cross one another? And it gives you this freedom to kind of pause and allow the characters to just banter and have some fun and dance around one another and kind of test one another conversationally, which is something I always love in these stories, when the two characters get to kind of square off for a little while and interrogate and cross-interrogate one another and find out what's really going on.
Yeah, yeah. Elena says something to Jack that really struck me as a novelist. She says, talks about how few individuals she has encountered. What does Elena mean by an individual?
So that's funny. When I wrote that, it is quite important to the novel, but you know how sometimes you introduce an idea, sometimes through a character that just feels right to that character, and then you suddenly realize that it is kind of like a key and a lock for the whole story that I hadn't anticipated and didn't really see until the whole of this was done. Honestly, on a very writerly level, that was kind of my version of a scene that I love from a James Salter novel, Light Years, where the two of the characters, he's introducing him to a tailor in New York because he wants his friend to meet this tailor, who he thinks of as just one of these people that you've got to meet, because you'll appreciate and respect what I'm seeing in this person's essence. And I wanted Elena to have some of that too, where in part she feels like Jack is the only person who can understand her. So when she has this idea about, they've always had this idea between, they're only a few individuals who are walking around the earth, and they're kind of without precedent or mold, and they're truly individual themselves. She thinks Jack is kind of the only person in her life who can understand what she means by that. And so she meets this kind of small time con man who's about to go down the Cape and work his own job, and she brings him by Jack's house for a night because she wants him to see this lovely thing that she's brought him that only the two of them can kind of grasp the meaning of. And for her, I think of her as kind of, she's an artist and she has a sense of artistry. And so when she sees it in the world, something authentic and beautiful, she wants to show the one other person in her life who can understand what that means.
Yeah, yeah. There's another fascinating statement that really struck me, and I would love to hear you unpack it a little bit. And that is, Jack says, in my experience, nearly all career criminals think of themselves romantically. The dabblers and civilians are the ones you have to watch out for.
That probably comes from my time as a lawyer, where it was my experience that, these accidental criminals always are a bit more erratic and dangerous, I think, when you're dealing with them. A sort of hardened career criminal has necessarily come up with a story for his life as to what it means and why he's made these decisions. And there are all these kind of codes of honor and conduct and these intricacies of what that life might mean. And it's essentially a romantic narrative that they've convinced themselves of their place in this criminal world. And I think that it's important to kind of understand that when you're dealing with them too, regardless if you're their lawyer or not. It's an interesting thing to kind of realize about these people. And the ones who aren't, they're the ones who I find a little bit more dangerous, especially the ones who don't think of themselves as criminals at all. Like, we've got a character here who's kind of the old money New England representation, Paulson, who is a successful lawyer and has all the trappings of being, a pillar of the society, but occasionally dabbles in some money laundering, or he'll hold something for a client that he's not supposed to be holding because he likes to feel tapped into that world of criminals and gangsters. And I find those people more dangerous, both on a practical level of your day-to-day life and your interaction with them, and on a moral level. They're quite a bit more dangerous because they really think of themselves as good in some way, that they're rich and successful, and that life has owed them to this because they were entitled to it. I find that very dangerous.
Yeah, with Paulson, I find the notion that somebody thinks that his time is worth $1,000 an hour. Like, I
That's
mean,
what they charge.
you can make an argument that is a criminal notion right there.
I know, isn't it? Oh, man, I remember I worked at sort of a big corporate practice in New York for a while, and when you first see what they charge for your time as at that point you're still in your 20s, and you're not worth it necessarily, but that somebody's still out there charging $600-700 an hour for you to look at a case for a little while and give your opinion on it. It's those rates are themselves ludicrous, but they can get them, and people will keep paying them, I guess.
So there's a point in the novel. I don't want to give anything away, so I'm not going to say what happens. But there's a point, and maybe more than one point, where something pretty dramatic happens, but it's related in a very matter of fact way, in just a sentence or two. We don't have what we get in some novels, a foreshadowing, or we slow the pace down before a big dramatic event is going to happen. Can you talk about how the style of narrative affects the reader's experience of the story?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'd like to think, as somebody who cares about this, that the style is everything about how the reader will experience this. But there is something satisfying to feeling like, when you are going to write a really dramatic, important scene, I think it's my instinct, I don't know about you, is to kind of underwrite it and strip away a lot of the art around the way that is being conveyed, because otherwise you're just you're going to be trying to do something purple and over the top and describe this big dramatic scene, and you can't really convey drama by just telling people, okay, my language is elevating, this is going to be dramatic now. I think it's more effective if you kind of lull them into a sense of security and comfort. And I think for me, that tends to be kind of a drawling prose where you feel like you're being told a story by a friend of yours, and there's a point to it, but you're not expecting anything too wild to happen. It's just you've met up with your friend at the end of the day, and something interesting happened to him, and he's going to tell you a little bit about it, and tell you a few of the ins and outs, and we'll take a diversion here, and then suddenly you can kind of hit them with the truly life altering thing that is actually being conveyed. And I find that, at least, to be personally a very effective mode of storytelling.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it sort of takes out in a good way the, for want of a better term, just the idea of, hey, you're not going to believe what happened to me. Like if you
Right.
leave out the you're not going to believe what happened to me, then the thing that happened to you is a lot more surprising when you get to it because you haven't necessarily set up this expectation.
Exactly. And for me, I almost all of my writing is conversational, right? That it feels like I want it to be, I want every scene to have the feeling that you have met up with your friend, or maybe a stranger in a bar in some far off hotel, and that you are just being told an interesting story. I like that as a basic atmosphere, and you are going to be on the hook. Maybe the reader, it gives this feeling like maybe the reader is participating in the story a little bit more, and I think it gives the narrator a sense that there's a real human voice that is doing the telling here.
Yeah, yeah. So you've used the term noir several times. We've talked about Casablanca a little bit. This novel certainly has been referred to as a neo noir novel. What for you in on the page? What are the essential elements of the noir, and how do you tap into those elements in the Stolen Coast?
I think I always kind of look to, I think like Megan Abbott and Laura Lippman have these perfect summations of noir that don't spring to mind immediately, but the sort of sense of them, the essence is that people whose lives have fallen short of their dreams in one way or another, and they're going to go for it anyway. And they're trying to, I think, in a good noir, all of the characters walking around have these hidden hopes and dreams and disappointments. And there's this kind of sense of fatality and doom that's trailing them around. And they are, against their better judgment, going to kind of pursue some of these private dreams of theirs. And we as the reader kind of know that there is a sense of faithfulness to them. And noir is just, I mean, it's about a worldview too. Personally, the kind of noir I love the most also has, it's not the real gritty tragic stories, that those have their place and their, I love those as well, but the thing I love the most is that world weary humor, and people who are going through very dark and disturbing things and maintaining about it a kind of a wit or an acceptance of that fate. And to me, that's a lot of what marks a good noir, is that ability to preserve some wit in the face of doom.
We talked a little bit about the difference between the season and the off season at a beach town, but there's just this quick descriptor you have where you talk about a beach town in the weeks after the season ends, and to me, even though you don't go into a lot of detail about what that means, it just has this very melancholy feel. That descriptor. Talk a little bit about the role that mood and atmosphere play in this novel.
Yeah, in that particular mood too, I think is one that even if you haven't been in a beach town after the season ends, you can, as you say, you can kind of imagine what it might feel like. There's sort of this relief in a way because the tourists have gone, but with them has also gone the opportunity to make some money. And honestly, in New England on September, boy, there couldn't be a nicer time of year to be here. There's a real pristineness to the air once the heat has cleared out and the tourists have cleared out. But there's also this atmosphere of, I think, immediate nostalgia for another summer has just passed. Another summer, it gets you thinking about your life. And it has that feeling of a new period in one's life, even if it's just a week away from what has just happened. The festivals have just ended, Labor Day is past, and now we're into September. And I think it feels very much like turning over a new period of the calendar and a new stage of one's life. So for me, that's the atmosphere I really like to live in. Those, the immediate aftermath where everybody's kind of reckoning with what has just happened. So in this case, there was a large festival as well. So you get to kind of, that feeling when you've been on a bender or a tear for a few days and you've been living in the moment, and then after that moment is done, you have to wrestle with what that might mean, what that exposed about yourself, what you've just done during that festival, that vacation from real life for a little while.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we like to end every episode of Inside the Writer Studio with the same 10 questions. You should be able to answer each of them in just a few words, but hopefully they'll give us a little insight into you and into your writing. So if you're ready, we will begin.
Do it.
What word do you love to work into your writing?
Immaculate.
What word do you hate to encounter in other people's writing?
Literally.
Where's your favorite place to write?
I like to move around a lot during the day, but my best writing is always in a library. I like to be in a good library.
Where could you never write?
I was a New Yorker for a long time, so I learned to write almost everywhere. I don't think I could write on the subway. I can do a lot of things on the subway, but I don't think I could write on the subway.
Yeah, yeah. To what rule of grammar do you pay least attention?
Most of them I would ignore. I kind of like to just go with the rhythm of it, but I suppose the idea that you need a subject at the beginning of a sentence, sometimes I like to just launch into the middle point in a sentence and ignore that subject altogether.
What was the first book you remember reading?
Summer of Summer of 49 was probably. I read a lot of baseball literature when I was young, and those are the first things I can remember moving from like some sort of kids book about baseball into like the Halberstam and Roger Kahn books about baseball. And those are my first books that I can really remember.
What are you reading now?
Right now, what did I bring with me on vacation? I think I have some historical fiction, The Spring of the Ram, that I brought with me that I had never dived into, and it was very good train reading. I took the Amtrak from New York to Boston and got to go along the New England coast with my historical fiction.
Nice, nice. What book would you like to have written?
Oh, that's a good one. I think because I'm working in this space now, I admire Elmore Leonard's books more than anything else I can think of at the moment, and kind of at various moments try to aspire to some of that perfection. And so I think almost all of his books I admire so deeply and wish I could write like that.
What sort of book would you like to write, but probably never will?
I'm not going to say never will, but I would love to write like a proper rom-com, just a romantic comedy in book form, and then we'll adapt it to the screen after.
Yeah. And finally, what would you like to hear a reader tell you?
That it was funny. I always want to make people laugh with these things. I know that's odd to say when you're talking about a crime book or a thriller, but I would die if people didn't think these books were funny. I think so. I need to know that I've made people laugh.
This has been Inside the Writer's Studio. I'm your host, Charlie Lovett, and my guest today has been Dwyer Murphy, whose novel, The Stolen Coast, is available wherever books are sold. Dwyer, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
Inside the Writer's Studio is sponsored by Bookmarks, a literary nonprofit that runs the largest annual book festival in the Carolinas and operates a community gathering place and nonprofit independent bookstore in downtown Winston-Salem, North Carolina. To find out more about Bookmarks and all its programs, visit www.bookmarksnc.org. Inside the Writer's Studio is proud to be affiliated with Libro FM. Unlike other audiobook platforms, Libro FM supports your local independent bookstore. Whether you buy a single book or, like me, a monthly subscription, you can link your account to your local store or to Bookmarks to support literary community. For a special 2-for-1 offer, go to Libro.fm and use the discount code WRITERS. If you've enjoyed Inside the Writer's Studio, please consider leaving a rating or review online at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Inside the Writer's Studio posts new episodes on the 1st and 15th of every month. On our next episode, I'll be talking with Alice Bell, author of the ghostly mystery Grave Expectations. Until then, thanks for listening, and may you read with wonder and write with passion.